Thank you, Professor Köchler, and thank you to Mark and the ICD for inviting me. Now I have to start with a disclaimer. So this is little about the wall. I start off with the wall. It's actually about a country that was probably not mentioned yet, called Switzerland, and it's about a bank. I think we haven't talked about banks, although we have talked about finance. But let's start with the theme of the conference. So let's go back to late 1989. A political science student, not me, I'm history, in Oxford, was about to complete his master thesis. His topic: why the two Germanys would never be reunited. When he gave the document to his supervisor, the latter commented, and I quote, "You'd better revise your final chapter and the title of your thesis. The wall had just come down." Now, I was in Oxford at the time. I had just started my doctoral thesis, and when this anecdote was making the rounds, or maybe it was simply an urban legend. These things come up whenever there is a large event. You have urban legends. But even if it was an urban legend, I still hang on to believing that it wasn't, because it is such a great and it's a very telling story, for me at least, in three respects. Number one, from the perspective of what I would call arrogance. And I think that was mentioned several times before at this event. So over the years, I've encountered many and more, actually the numbers increase over time, people that now tell us they had expected the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. Now, such people would, of course, look down upon that poor, stupid student that didn't know, at the time. Number two, and that's closely linked to number one, is the advantage of hindsight. A student working on such a thesis, and I think that's a reminder to all of us when we're students, in early 1989, that's probably when he started, or before that, would definitely not have started with the assumption that the Berlin Wall was about to come down, let alone Germany becoming reunited. As we all know, the regime was celebrating the 40th anniversary of GDR just about in October of 1989, and still looked by and large in a pretty dominant place. So what if the student had submitted his thesis in September 1989? And thirdly, and that's about historians tend to avoid predicting the future, as they usually conclude from the study of history that the future might turn out quite differently to what was predicted at a particular point. I always say, half jokingly, I leave that to economists that use historical data to predict the future. What about, for instance, what we in finance call tail risks? That is single, sudden, unexpected events that have a major impact on the course of developments. How do we factor in, let's say, Fukushima into the development of, let's say, the German government's attitude towards nuclear power? But today I will do both, and I will put on both of my hats as the company's historian, as UBS historian, and as its head of corporate responsibility. So I will try to, of course, go back in history, but also look into the future. History tells us, in inverted commas, where we come from, how we evolved, the challenges we faced or created, and how we overcame these, or not. The Berlin Wall is, of course, an excellent example of how we did overcome something. Now, sustainability, let's call it that, the other part of my job, is about challenges too. And some of these challenges were referred to before. Now, some of these challenges, and that's as far as I go with the analogy, could be compared to walls. And actually walls that are growing in size and height as we speak. And there was reference before to the topic of global warming, so that's just one example. Now, to get a clear sense, and that's something that we are very concerned looking at very strongly, of what I'm talking about, I advise everyone to look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 goals, signed off by over 190 states in 2015 and officially launched by the UN in 2016, provides a comprehensive overview of exactly the challenges that I'm referring to. And I think if you then go into the sub-targets of the 17 goals, it becomes even clearer. So what about the steps that we can and should take to tackle these challenges, to bring down these walls of the 21st century? And actually, there's a key component that makes them very different to the MDGs, the predecessor from 2000, the Millennium Development Goals. And that is when the UN and its Secretary General at the time launched it, and they still do. So whether it's Ban Ki-moon or Guterres, they still emphasize that, is the need for investment to tackle the challenges. So when you look at the MDGs, I don't think there was ever mention of the investment needs, at least not private investments. The estimates, believe it or not, today are as high as $7 trillion per annum if we want to get to where we want to get in 2030. So looking at that, it becomes with a very direct task or ask to financial institutions like ours, and that we are working on. But before that, I'd like to give some historical context, because this is really ultimately about the relationship between a bank, society, and the economy. So let's jump back quite a way into history, go back 170 years. And you can imagine this is 1849, Europe. What's the key concern in Europe at the time? It's actually, I would say, building railways. Of course, you could say the key concern, if you're a political historian, it's actually the revolution of 1848-49. If you look at the economy, Britain in 1849 had about 10,000 kilometers of rail tracks already. The German states, about 6,000 kilometers of rail tracks. Well, guess what Switzerland had? 23.3 kilometers of rail tracks in 1849. And exactly 3 train stations, whereas the rest of Europe, excluding Britain, had about 700. So one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful Swiss person at the time, the president of the National Parliament of Switzerland, Alfred Escher, the man who later founded a number of institutions and is probably best known for the creation of what is the Gotthard Tunnel and the Gotthard Railway. That was eventually opened in 1882 and created that link through Switzerland to Italy. He made it very clear that Switzerland has to be concerned, but it might be circumvented by all these railway lines, that people would go around because there's nothing happen in Switzerland. So in the spirit of the day, Switzerland took this task, and essentially what happened, by the end of the 1850s, there were 650 kilometers. They doubled by 1864. They doubled again by 1870, so we're now at about 2,700 kilometers of railway lines. And as we all know, Switzerland now got one of the most developed railway systems in the world. And it has such things as the Gotthard Tunnel, or it recently built, which I think is, and that's something that's sort of only been alluded to today, pretty unique in Europe. It recently opened a tunnel of over 50 kilometers, I mean, projects like that in Europe, unfortunately, are not the reality of the day anymore. So, what we see here is that the development of Switzerland, the railway development, the industrialization, the development that actually made Switzerland today probably the 21st or the 22nd largest economy in the world. I mean, you can imagine that country, I'm German actually, the country has 8 million people. It's about the 21st or 22nd largest economy in the world. But the critical piece, and this is where the banks come in, and this is, I think, one of the lessons around that, is, of course, what happened was the creation of a new type of bank. So the realization at the time that what was happening here, what was needed to be financed, could not be financed by the existing banking system. As we all know, there was a banking system. You had plenty of private banks in Switzerland at the time, but here a new type of bank was needed, and the model was actually a French bank. It was the Crédit Mobilier de France, created in 1852, and this was the type of bank, similar to Deutsche Bank in Germany, then created 149 years ago, by the way, so they have their anniversary next year. The type of bank that was actually to become industrial and commercial bank, like ours, like the predecessors of our bank. And the point about these banks was to finance the development of industry, the development of traffic, the development of commerce in countries like Switzerland and in other countries too, because this actually happened all around Europe. And when you look at it, for instance, that's why I picked the year 1862. This is our first historical route, Winterthur, which is about 25 kilometers from Zurich, for those of you who know Switzerland. When you look at that, what happened in 1862 when this bank was created by the local leadership, so actually local commercial leaders, industrial leaders, the mayor, so they all came together to create this. And when you look at the statutes of that, just the first part of the statutes, it becomes very clear, because it says there, this bank is created to promote local industry, craftsmen, and agriculture, and more broadly, commerce and infrastructure. And with that, with the creation of these banks, we also see the creation of modern Switzerland in an economic sense. Its railway system, its education system, its export industry. Now, the societal purpose, and this is, of course, the key piece also when I look back to the SDGs, the societal purpose of all of this was, of course, very evident, if only for the very simple reason that the development of the country created many and many new jobs. To the extent to which, by the way, and that's probably little known, that only a short time later, Switzerland had to draw upon workers from other countries. In fact, from what I see, Switzerland actually had a higher percentage of, for instance, of workers from Germany than it has today. Just before the First World War, there were probably about 220,000 Germans working in Switzerland. A lot of them actually left Switzerland again, because of the First World War. Unfortunately, probably many of them didn't survive because they actually fought in the war 1914 to 1918. Let's just quickly look at a few more examples around that. So, urbanization. When you look at 1850, every 15th Swiss person lives in a city. 1850, mid-19th century. By 1910, it was every fourth. Okay. Zurich, today the largest city in Switzerland, had 42,000 inhabitants in 1850. It had 215,000 already in 1910. Basel, another important one, due to the chemical and pharmaceutical industries, went from 28,000 to 132,000. What's also interesting in this pioneering sense, in this change for the entire society and the way that society interacted with the economy and the banks as enablers of that, is of course that locations with railway connections became the more successful places. So there's interesting evidence to see that places that didn't have railway connections, that might have been successful before, actually lost that kind of success because they did not have the railway connection. But there are also other interesting aspects in this kind of development in the way that the economic upsurge also created broader impacts. For instance, the very simple truth of if you build railways, you need railway sleepers, the wooden things that actually carry the tracks. Now, that meant that Switzerland cut down, and I'm sure it applies to many other countries, thousands of oak trees to create railway sleepers, and they replaced them with fast-growing trees. So when you look at the sort of idea of forestry, and I come back to that later on, that, of course, is an interesting aspect in the context of that. Agriculture. Switzerland transitioned to what would have been called yellow Switzerland to green Switzerland. Nothing to do with green in the sense of the 21st century. What it actually meant is that before, Switzerland was largely known for growing cereals for own consumption, wheat and others. Afterwards, it was actually having a lot more grazing land for animal fodder, etc. So yellow to green. And the cultural changes. Just to give you one example about time, that's and I quote, communities with rail connection now both had local and railway time. So there were now two times at that point. No longer was it the sound of the church bell that moved the farmer to drop the pitchfork, but the whistling of the midday train, which drew him to do some train watching at the railway embankment. So you have a cultural change too in simple things such as the concept of time. The concept of time for the average person in society is now determined by the train and not by the church bell anymore, or by the sun, presumed before that. So when you link that to the banks, then of course you could say that of course these new industrial commercial banks, like the predecessors of our bank, of UBS, had helped to change the economy, radically change the economy of the country, that is Switzerland in this case. And actually beyond recognition within very short period of time. And that, and I emphasize the word indirectly, of course, the banks had a very clear impact upon the society and the development of the society of that country. Let's jump 100 years into the future from 1862, go to 1962. Why I picked 1962? Very simply because the bank celebrated its 100th anniversary of existence. In fact, for UBS, because we are the result of a merger of two major Swiss banks in 1998, Union Bank of Switzerland, Swiss Bank Corporation. By the way, today we're UBS. There is no long word to it. Those two banks celebrated their 100th anniversary, one in 1962, the other one in 1972. So the 60s are a good way of looking at that. But let's have a look at the way that just before these banks still perceived themselves. The money of, and I quote from a brochure, from the 1940s, the money of a bank like that must move here, there, wherever it is needed. Wherever it is useful, enables initiatives, advances the economy, and creates jobs. Many are the services that a Swiss large bank, which these were by now pretty large banks, provides day after day, hour by hour, to the public, business, the state. Now, the term public in this might create the impression that society at large had dealings with these banks, with our predecessor banks. Now in reality, still at that point in the 40s, 50s of the 20th century, most of the bank services went to companies and in part to the state. But even the direct societal impact of the banks had already been changing. Take an analysis from Swiss Bank Corporation from the beginning of the 1970s. And I quote, "Since the beginning of the 1920s, the bank has increasingly partaken in the cultural and societal life by supporting science, art, and charitable activities. Companies are increasingly," so they're speaking more broadly, not just about the banks, "companies are increasingly convinced of the need to transgress the boundaries of its business activities and to actively participate in the tackling of challenges," so we're back to challenges, "of more general nature, as well as of the development of new intellectual horizons for the present and the future." So this concept of the societal role is not a new one, and you can see that from this particular quote from the early 1970s. But there was an important economic factor, of course, that created massive change, particularly in the 1960s, and that is, of course, the massive boom that Europe, including Switzerland, experienced at the time, which actually led to greater demands and needs by the population. So a bank like ours that had previously focused on industrial and commercial finance only, now offered products and services to the wider public. So the public did come in. Some of you may not know, but actually mortgages, savings accounts, deposit accounts, for us that was a new development in the 1960s. And you also could see the technological advance that came with that. So speaking of conquering challenges, one of them was actually how do you give people, the younger ones among us might sort of laugh, but how do you give people access to money the entirety of the 24-hour day? That was actually the introduction of the cash machine. The first cash machine was introduced in the UK, in London, in mid-1967. So when you go to a cash machine next time, you'll know it's kind of 52 years old, in terms of its creation. And the first one in Switzerland was, introduced by our bank in November 1962, just introduced at the head office. And I can tell you, these are moments that historians laugh. Or laugh about or love, both, because essentially the reactions of people to something completely new. You stand in front of something that had never been there before. Money is coming out of a wall. You just got to visualize that. So it was interesting just to read the newspaper reports about this particular invention and innovation, because it was to the extent, and I'll quote one thing just for the amusement, is one journalist was seriously writing, at 75,000 francs a machine, it's too much for the average household. So the concept was that everybody would eventually have their own cash machine at home, and they could just take out money. We call it e-banking today, but it's a different notion. And as far as I know, at one point in time, there were only 3 people that had their own cash machine. It was the Queen in Buckingham Palace, the Pope in the Vatican, and apparently Alice Cooper in his car. Whoever remembers Alice Cooper, but anyway, that's a different thing. There were other innovations like driving cash. People may not know that. If you're in the US, it still exists. You could drive with your car to a counter and you take out money like you would do a burger today. Not very successful, I can tell you, in Switzerland, because people didn't trust that. But I think what's also interesting, just in sort of terms of sort of pioneering spirit in Europe, and I really talk about Europe, I don't talk about the European Union, I talk about the continent of Europe, is a bank like ours, it grew from about 4,000 employees to 10,000 employees within a decade. Actually, if you take one of them, it would have been that. What I found interesting is more than nearly half of those 10,000 were younger than 25 years of age. So I think that's an interesting thing on how people perceived the fact that they could actually have an influence on the development of the economy and society. So very clear impact here. So these banks, our predecessor banks, became universal banks. They covered literally everyone. Retail clients, private clients, institutional clients, corporate clients. That's a major development in the 1960s. But, actually one of interesting thing, another facet of this wider societal reach and relevance of banks in that time was actually that our bank became the first bank to screen a TV advert. The very first time that Switzerland actually screened TV adverts, which was February 1965. So there, by the way, to all of you, history and marketing, there was no TV advertising in Switzerland before February 1965. And one of the 8 products and companies, the very first, was actually a bank. And what then happened is the introduction of media conferences, investor relations conferences and so on. All of these things hadn't happened. So there was a much more direct interaction with society that it developed in the 1960s. So let's move in that kind of triangle of bank, society, economy to the point that I shouldn't normally do as a historian, that is, where we're heading now. 2 months ago saw the launch of the Principles for Responsible Banking, initiated and backed by the UN. Actually, it was an initiative of the United Nations Environmental Program, to be specific, finance initiative of that. Now, the principles are focused on supporting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, so that's where I close the loop, and actually also the Paris Agreement on climate. It's very explicitly stated in there. So UBS, the bank that I work for, alongside a good number of other banks, became founding signatories in September 2019, and of course more banks are signing up as we speak. Now, what does that mean, actually, this particular development, as kind of symbolizing what we're talking about, for the relationship between economy, society, and bank? Number one, to me, these principles symbolize the role of something that has been there for a while, and that is, of course, the role of the bank as an intermediary between economy and society. It enables financing, and I think that's the critical piece around these, that fulfills an economic and societal purpose. And the demands for investments which incorporate ESG, so I think something that if you haven't looked at, you should look at, environmental, social, governance criteria, has grown massively in recent past and is growing as we speak. So just to give you an example, the 130 plus founding signatories of these principles represent over US dollars 47 trillion. Okay, so when you look at the assets of all of these banks, we're talking about US dollars 47 trillion, so there is a lot of potential there. Number two, a very important development, sustainability as an ever-growing factor for economic success. Now, we talk about sustainability challenges. Actually, what's interesting is, of course, the more and more companies perceiving it as something that actually enables them to be economically or more economically successful. The growing realization in that actually of the role of sustainable finance. One of the interesting developments in the EU, and of course there has been a lot of discussions around the European Union, is the whole action plan around sustainable finance. And in the way that that is playing into advancing the whole sustainability topic across the economies of the European Union. And it's interesting for me, for instance, that the main trade association in Switzerland just recently, about 1 or 2 months ago, published a paper on sustainable finance. Now, this is an association that has mainly non-financial sector companies. So when I go to events with other companies, and I do that regularly, I get more and more questions because, of course, companies relate very directly, and your comment about institutional investors is, of course, a critical piece here, pension funds and so on, to the fact what sustainable finance will actually mean for their development in future. And I think the third point is a very simple one, and that is the growing expectations of society. Expectations of society to tackle, for banks to contribute to the tackling of societal and environmental challenges, those so-called walls of today and to the future. So if you look into the 2020s, and the SDGs, the date is 2030, I've picked another date, but if you say the 2020s, then we know that sustainable investing will increasingly become the standard. That's a clear prediction for the 2020s, and it's confirmed by all the clients that we interview, and we interview a lot of clients on that. And just to pick up on the institutional investors, just to give you an example, we did a survey of 600 institutional investors, and 78%, and I've been with a bank for 17 years, and I've never ever seen numbers like that, 78% of those institutional investors surveyed have already at this point integrated ESG criteria into their investment processes. 69% are of the view that including ESG criteria, and that's very critical from a financial perspective, reduce risks to their investment. So by doing that, they will actually reduce the risk to the investment. And 48%, so about half, integrate ESG criteria because they believe that this will actually lead to a better financial performance. And if you add those that will argue that it will have at least the same financial performance as conventional investing, then you are at a very substantial majority. So there is clearly a very substantial cultural change happening. So in conclusion, I think today, and this has come out of the discussions here, there is, of course, a very strong, and it's come up over and over again, a very strong focus on digitalization. You know, one of the trends that we all talk about, it's digital, 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 and not surprisingly though, and there is a good case for that. It is a mega trend, and it really affects all of us. But I think we should also see sustainability, whichever term you want to use, let's use sustainability, as exactly such a mega trend too. You know, so we should also keep a very strong focus one, and it's actually an absolutely necessary one. We have at our bank clearly recognized it as such, and we are supporting our institutional, private, and corporate clients to invest accordingly. And I think ultimately, and my final point, it kind of, to me as a historian, to come back to that, brings together what is actually the starting point of the concept of sustainability. Exactly now 306 years ago here in Germany. And that was actually the concept, by Karl von Kalowitz of the forestry concept. So sustainability comes out of the forestry concept, which basically means if you keep cutting down your tree, if you're an owner of a forest and you keep cutting down your trees, you will eventually be bankrupt, to put it very mildly and very simply. So essentially you need to do something about the forest, because the first priority in that is that it's actually your own economic survival. So I think this kind of notion of bringing together sustainability and the economic purpose of sustainability is actually at the heart of the origins of the term, and I think this is exactly where the developments are heading as we speak. So thanks for that, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to not actually speak about the Berlin Wall, but about something else.
Thank you for your speech, and thank you for a different approach and a different topic. I would have two very small questions.
Sure.
Firstly, two topics that you touched. First, which of the 17 goals, sustainability goals, do you think is the most challenging? And the second question is, could you mention some concrete environmental sustainability initiatives that your bank has?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think the first one is a very subjective one, because ultimately, there is a challenge around all of them, and I think ultimately depends on in which kind of context you're in. I would certainly actually for me personally, because I think it's a very personal one. For me, it's actually quality education. I mean, if I had to highlight one, then it's that. Because to me, a lot of the other things derive from that. A lot of the discussions that we've had today are linked to quality education, Because ultimately, it's about the level of understanding. We had a discussion at lunch, today, we have more information available than ever before in the history of humankind. I mean, just go on your internet and you find everything and anything. Well, information is not knowledge, and information is also not really understanding what the information is actually about. So quality education is a key component. It comes back to the question that was asked before, about science. How do you put things into context if you don't have the ability, the chance to put things into context? So I think quality education, to me personally at least, is a key thing. I'm sure, you can have an argument for every single one of the 17. I think 17 itself actually is extremely critical. The whole concept of partnership, when you look at all the other 16, what do we do with our partnership models, to advance on them, But I think we could have an interesting it's actually not a short question, sorry, it's a long question, And the second one, well, we look particularly, and this is maybe SG 13, what we do particularly is to look at where we can develop opportunities for our clients when it comes to climate. So investing in terms of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So if I think of one particular topic, in terms of our activities with our clients, it's that. Actually, the other one is health. One of our most successful funds was, over the last 3 years, was an oncology impact fund, nearly $500 million Swiss francs, which really just does one thing, which is to invest in startups that are developing ways to combat cancer. So I think it's these particular developments which I find, to your question, which I find particularly relevant. But of course, there would be other examples, but let's just highlight those two.